Hello, Psychology of Learning students. So we are in week 4 of the semester, and we're going to be covering chapter 4 this week. There'll be 2 videos, and when we are done with this chapter, we are done with the information that will be covered on the Unit 1 exam. So next week, there are no videos to watch, no assignments to do. Next week, the only thing that you're going to do is take the exam, and the exam will cover chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4. But for this week, we're going to go through chapter 4. So let's get started. And I'm going to share the screen so you can see the PowerPoint slides for chapter 4. This is one of my most favorite chapters because it has to do with applying all of the theoretical things that we know about classical conditioning to the real world. It's through this chapter, the applications of classical conditioning, that we make psychology improve our lives and improve the lives of our friends and families. It's one of the ways that psychology really helps the human race, helps us to be more happy, more healthy, manage our emotions better, have a more satisfying life. So let's get started. So in this first video, we're going to talk about fear, prejudice, and paraphilias. In the next video, we're going to talk about drug addiction, advertising, and healthcare. So really, we would not care, like there wouldn't be a whole course that you're required to take, like psychology of learning, where about a third of the course is focused on classical conditioning. If classical conditioning just let us know that you can make dogs salivate to a metronome, I mean, like who cares? I mean, we kind of care, but you know what I mean? So, but the thing is that classical conditioning can help us to understand a whole bunch of different feelings and behaviors that people have and animals have. Fear, prejudice, paraphilia, taste aversion, advertising, drug addiction, healthcare. Classical conditioning or Pavlovian conditioning can inform all of these areas. And so it becomes really important. And you now can sort of understand why we have a whole course in it that we require that you take. Just in case you're triggered by a spider, snake, or blood, there is going to be some on the next slide. So if that's going to trigger you, just fast forward through the next slide. Okay, so fear is one of the emotions that's really easy to classically condition. Now, before, like right around the time classical conditioning is coming out and Pavlov's learning all this stuff, at the time, people sort of thought that humans and animals were innately born with a whole bunch of different fears, that we were innately afraid of spiders, innately afraid of snakes, innately afraid of blood, innately afraid of heights. And so that it was sort of thought, boy, all of these things will naturally lead to fear. They didn't need to be learned in any way. But Watson, through some of his research, learned that that's just not true. We're born with there are very few things that innately we're afraid of. So one of the things that human beings are innately afraid of is loud noises. So an infant does not need to learn that if a loud noise happens behind them or around them, that they should be afraid. So if you do a really loud noise behind an infant, the infant will startle and cry and get upset, visibly will appear to be distressed. And you don't need to teach the child, the infant, to be afraid of a loud noise. They automatically are. And it seems as though most of, or many of the other things that we're afraid of because at some point they were paired with one of the things that we are innately afraid of. So if you're afraid of blood, then maybe blood and a loud noise happened together for you, or 2 other stimuli ended up getting put together. So it's just in the way that Pavlov's dogs learned to salivate to the metronome, because the metronome was paired with the food. So metronome food salivate, metronome food salivate, metronome food salivate, eventually metronome salivate. So the pairing of the metronome and the food over and over and over again, those 2 stimuli getting paired, eventually leads the metronome to lead to that conditioned response of salivating. In the same way, this can happen with fear. And so it's with the association of what was a neutral stimulus, like maybe blood, with an inborn stimulus like a loud noise that leads to the fear. So blood, loud noise, fear, blood, loud noise, fear, blood, loud noise, fear. Now blood, and you're afraid. And so one of the famous experiments, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about this piece. So Watson calls these conditioned emotional responses. And he says that basically classical conditioning can lead to fear, love, hate, disgust. In fact, he hypothesizes that much of what leads us to be afraid, to feel attraction toward, to feel disgust for, to hate, that they're all largely learned through classical conditioning, that classical conditioning plays a big role in all of these emotions. Now, one thing I need to make sure that you really understand is the difference between fear and phobia. So phobia is much more extreme than regular fear. So if you're afraid of something, you might be apprehensive, you might want to stay away from it. But if you have to, you'll do it anyway. Does that kind of make sense? So I had, when I was a graduate student, I had a fear of public speaking. The thoughts of having to stand up in front of people and talk made me apprehensive. It wasn't something that I thought would be a positive experience. It brought up some fear. But then maybe my third year in the program, they had us teach. And so I was going to be standing in front of about 50 students, all in one of those rooms where the rows get higher and higher, and you sort of feel like a speck looking up at everyone. And the thoughts of standing in front of people like that and having to teach really made me afraid, to the extent that I threw up before, for the first few weeks, I threw up before I had to lecture each time. But it was still a fear, not a phobia, because I didn't decide to change my major over it or not go for a PhD because of it. I didn't not go to work that day or call in sick. I still slept the night before. It wasn't like a life altering, it's really making it hard for me to continue living my life. It was just like a really unpleasant experience. So an unpleasant experience, fear. A phobia, it's now interfering with your life. It's excessive. It's really distressing. It's a persistent fear of a specific thing. And usually the persistent fear is so great that it impacts your life. So it would be like, I would decide to say, I can't teach. I'm not going to do this. People who are afraid of, who have phobias with flying, they choose to drive long distances. Like they'll drive for 3 days to avoid getting on a plane. So, but if you're on the plane, then you probably don't have a phobia. You're just afraid of it. So that's kind of the difference, how much it affects your life. And as you can tell, since I teach for a living now, once I did it for a couple of weeks, I found out I loved it and it was lots of fun. But the idea of it seemed it brought up some fear. Phobias are by far the most common psychological issue of all of the issues. And it's not most, but it's less than 50%, but it's a large percentage of people at some point in their life will have a phobia. Really, really common thing. Now, how do phobias begin? Well, this film that I would love for you to see, I'm not going to play it right now because if I play it as part of this video, then it makes the bandwidth, I forget what it's called, really big, and it might make some of you have a hard time loading this video on your into your computer so that you can watch it. So just watch this on your own. It's in the PowerPoint slides. So click on it so that you're able to see it. And this is a YouTube video about John Watson actually training little Albert to become afraid of white rabbits. And so you'll see in the video, it's kind of a funky video, so I'm going to go over here. So it's because it's blurry. So it's a very famous experiment. It's not even really an experiment, it's more of a case study, but very, very famous. If you are a psychology major, which most of you are, everyone is going to expect that you know who little Albert is. So little Albert's mother, I think, was one of the assistants that worked with John B. Watson. And so little Albert was brought into the lab, and they bring him a white rabbit, and he's not afraid of the rabbit at all. A white rat, not afraid of that at all. Everything's fine. But then what they do is they pair a really loud noise right behind little Albert's head, and wicked loud noise, and then, I'm sorry, the rabbit, and then a wicked loud noise, a rabbit, and a wicked loud noise, a rabbit, wicked loud noise. It doesn't take very many pairings of this, where then when the rabbit comes, little Albert is very afraid of it, tries to get away from it, is really unhappy with the fact that there's a rabbit there with him. And they even show how later he was afraid of even like a white furry thing, whether it's a white rabbit, a white rat, or even a woman with a white furry coat on. So he showed that it could generalize pretty easily. Okay, so we now know that we can in a laboratory make someone become afraid of something through classical conditioning. Now, for ethical reasons, we're not going to do that. But how can we use classical conditioning to get rid of these phobias? Well, this is what Watson did some research to look into this. And it's called counter conditioning or exposure therapy. And with this, what you can do is gradually introduce the rabbit or whatever the person or the animal is afraid of, followed by a really positive stimulus, something that leads to an emotion that they want to have. So not fear, maybe the feeling of love, or maybe something that they really like food. Okay, so it gets paired with a very pleasant thing, and that will get rid of this fear of whatever it is you're afraid of. Now, the counter conditioning or the exposure therapy, it's sort of morphed as time has gone on. So one part of exposure therapy is you just, put the person with the rabbit right there. They're afraid of the rabbit. You just get them and the rabbit together. But what happens is that a lot of people, if you're really afraid of a rabbit, you're not going to stick around. When the therapist brings the rabbit in the room, you're going to fly out the door or duck and hide your head, so that it's not even going to be possible for the therapist to pair this rabbit with something positive, because it's like fight or flight. You just wig out, you're going to get out of there. So it never gets paired with something positive. So because of that, oftentimes what therapists will use is what we call systematic desensitization. So rather than bringing a rabbit in, we do it with something very much smaller than a rabbit, like a picture of a rabbit. So the therapist sits there with the person and shows them a picture of a rabbit. And even the picture of the rabbit will get the person nervous. I've got a great video under supplementary material. It says phobias. I think it says phobias on it. And it's of a woman who's really afraid of birds. And you get to see some systematic desensitization that is done with her therapist. So, and it gives you an example of what this could look like. So when you're shown the picture of the rabbit, the person who has a rabbit phobia will become visibly distressed. Their heart rate will increase, their palms will sweat, their mouth will dry up. They're going to act as though their heart rate will increase. They're going to act as though they're very afraid, because they are. But then you're going to pair that picture with something very nice. Maybe it's soft music, maybe it's a food that they like, but you're going to pair it with a stimulus that they really like that leads to calm, that does an emotion that you can't have fear at the same time. And so then when they get to the point, so you do that several pairings. Now, when you show them the picture of the dog, the picture of the rabbit, they're not afraid at all. It's fine. Then you might go to the next step and you have them watch a movie of a rabbit until they're okay with watching the movie of a rabbit. Then maybe you have a rabbit in the room, but way on the other side of the room, in a cage way far away from them. And you wait and you pair it with something positive, till they're okay with that. And then the rabbit gets closer and closer. And then eventually the rabbit comes out of the cage, and eventually the rabbit sits on your lap. And now you are cured. you're no longer afraid of this rabbit. So systematic desensitization. Another trigger warning, the next slide has a picture of a spider. So uh, go through it fast if you're afraid of spiders. So what is happening more recently, just like in the last 10 years or so, maybe it's been 15, but pretty recent when we're talking about learning, where most of this, occurred in Watson's in the 1920s. So is virtual reality exposure therapy, VRET. So here you can use computer software. You put a helmet, like any kind of a virtual reality helmet on with goggles, and the person knows that they're in a lab, or a therapist's office. They know that they're not in any real danger, but boy, it looks real on the screen. And if you use smells and touch and taste, you can really make them feel like they're in the situation. And it's even a quicker way to use desensitization, and a quicker way to use exposure therapy, where they can't like run out of the room because the rabbit's there. Okay. And VRET, your book talks about how it's been used with fear of spiders or arachnophobia, how it's been used with PTSD, with fear of public speaking, with fear of math, fear of water. They give a couple more examples in the book too. Okay. So that's, you can see how classical conditioning can be applied to phobias, to make it so that we're less afraid of things, to reduce the phobias that people have. Now let's talk about another issue, prejudice. So now what is prejudice? So the definition of prejudice is it's when we believe, when we have an attitude toward an individual person based solely on the fact that they're a member of a social group. So we have an impression of someone when we really don't know anything about them, but our impression, our opinion about them is there because they belong to a social group. Now, believe it or not, prejudice, if you feel positively toward the person because they're part of a social group, that's still prejudice. And some of you might go, well, that's good prejudice. Well, I would argue no, that any kind of prejudice, you're sort of robbing the person of their individuality, their humanity, of how they're a unique and individual person, and that we shouldn't be judged based on the social groups that we belong to, that we're all individuals. Now, yes, belonging to a social group, especially one that you voluntarily joined, does give you an idea perhaps about what that person's attitudes and beliefs and opinions might be. But we oftentimes will have prejudice toward people who are members of social groups that they didn't even get a choice to belong to. So like, I was born as a female, I was born white, I was born into the family I was born into. And so if you have prejudice toward me, you believe that I'm going to have certain attitudes, knowledge, beliefs, abilities, because I was born female, because I was born white, because I was born to a middle-class family. That's all prejudice. And you're sort of missing me, like the unique person that I am. So prejudice are these preconceived opinions that we have about someone because they belong to a certain social group. And what many people argue now is that we learn prejudice just the same way as we learn fear, that it's through association. And one of the ways that it can be learned is so insidious. It's kind of amazing to me. And so I want to share this with you. And to share it with you, I'm going to illustrate it by having us play a game. So I'm going to put 6 words on the screen. And each word that I give you, I want you to write down good or bad. Okay, if you want to do it in a Word file, you can, or just say it out loud if you don't want to write it out. But if you don't have a piece of paper right now, just press pause, run and get a piece of paper, scratch a piece of paper with a pen or pencil. Okay, when you're ready, turn it back on. Okay, I'm going to assume everyone's ready. You either have a piece of paper or you've got a Word file open, or you're just going to do it orally. Okay, I'm going to flash some words on a screen. After I flash the word on the screen, I want you to write down good or bad, or you could put G for good and B for bad if you don't want to write something out. Okay, first word, dark. So good or bad. Fat. Good or bad. Light. Good or bad. Extreme, good or bad. Lower, good or bad. Loud, good or bad. Okay, so look at what you put for each of these. This is the same order that I presented them to you. And if we were meeting face to face, I could ask you what you did, but I'm going to tell you what at least Dr. Stephanie Stern, who's taught this class several times, has said. She says that in her classes, the majority of students file dark as bad, fat as bad, light as good, extreme is about 50-50. Half the class will have it as good, half the class will have it as bad. Lower is bad, and loud is bad. Now, what made these words have these good and bad connotations? Why do we think lower is bad? Why is loud bad? We can all think of situations where loud is good. You go to a concert, loud is fun. You go to maybe some kind of a dance club, loud is a good time. So like, why negative? Why do we have negative connotations and positive connotations to some of these words? And why does it differ? Like, why do half the people is positive for extreme and half the people is negative for extreme? And what people who believe in classical conditioning, or what psychologists believe, is that these words have been associated with things that are good or bad many, 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 many times. So either you've been reading, and in the stories, dark is bad, light is good, lower is bad, loud is bad. So these things are appearing together in sentences. And in the reading, maybe you're watching a lot of movies, and in movies, like having a dark hat, a black hat, that's a cue to you that it's the bad guy. And the white hat, that's a cue to you that it's the good guy. So you have learned through classical conditioning that certain words usually are paired with good things, and certain words are usually paired with bad things. So you learn certain words are good and certain words are bad. So you can think about, like, how did you learn that these words were good or bad? Think back to your classical conditioning history. When you think back, if you were one of the people who had as light as good, do you remember the time where light was paired with positive things? Probably not. I mean, I know when I did this test, I had lower as bad. I have no idea where I got lower as bad, right? I mean, lower can be good in a lot of specific situations, but I hear the word lower and I think, that's not a positive word. Like, if I have to do good or bad, I'm going to do bad to lower. But I probably many, many times, lower has been used in sentences when we were talking about things that were not good. Like, you scored lower on the exam, that was bad. So now lower and bad are connected, associated in my head. And I think of lower and I think negative thoughts. I think bad. Now, how can this help us understand how prejudices against people can occur? Well, all we need is to be exposed to a lot of different images or words or stories where people of certain groups, or a group's name is given, and good or bad things are given. And then we're going to form an association. Is that going to make sense? The media is very, very powerful in this. You can see how easily it could be. So think back on the last the last Netflix movie that you saw, or TV show that you saw. Think about the jobs that the people had. Think about how the people were portrayed. Now, this isn't like in your face, it's just how it was. Was a character who was white, did they have a higher status position than some of the characters that were African American or Asian or Native American? Did the male characters have more status than the female characters? Did the homosexual characters, if they let you know about that, have less status than the heterosexual characters? All of those things can help us, because we're going to learn through association, help us to start to come up with a prejudice that African Americans or Native Americans or Asians or homosexuals or women have lower status than men, and prejudice begin to develop. Does that make sense? Your book has a great uh, talks about a great study about the word Muslim being associated or put into the sentences so often with extremist bombing after 9/11, and how that ended up being very negative, leading to increased prejudice toward people who were toward Muslims, even though the majority of Muslims had nothing to do with 9/11 and condemned it as much as non-Muslim Americans. So you can see how this could work through classical conditioning. Now, how can we use classical conditioning to do the opposite? Think about how easy this would be. If in Netflix, if we started seeing, it was also almost as common to see homosexual people have higher status sometimes and lower status positions sometimes. If race and status were not lined up in what we're watching in TV, if they were no longer associated, if gender wasn't associated, if those things and status were not lined up well, then that would no longer, those associations could be broken or unlearned and not taught in the first place. My kids showed me, I think it's called Brooklyn Nine-Nine. It's a show, and one of the main characters in it is an it's all about police station. And one of the main characters in it, the sergeant, is an African-American homosexual man. And he is very emotionless. And so, like, they'll say, he'll go, "I am so happy right now." And I find his character in watching the show wonderful, because so often the media portrays people who are homosexual as being so emotional and flamboyant and like over the top. And they show instead, here's a homosexual man who's just very monotone. And the highest status character in the whole show, everyone just adores him, is we oftentimes don't see non-whites and homosexuals in the role that they have this man playing. And if we could show in TV shows and movies, it doesn't have to flip back the other way, but if it could just be random, where sometimes then we wouldn't learn the association that higher status people are white or that higher status people are heterosexual. And so that's how classical conditioning could be used to try to lessen racism. Okay, now let's talk about paraphilias. So Freud said how people are polymorphously perverse. What does he mean by that? He means that although there are some things that innately bring our species sexual pleasure, we can learn to find almost anything sexually pleasurable. So through classical conditioning, we can learn this pretty easily. So paraphilia literally means incorrect love, but really what we mean by it is experiencing sexual pleasure from something that's not considered, or that's considered not normal. Now, not normal doesn't necessarily mean bad. I don't want people to think, oh, that means it's bad. It could mean it's bad. Let's go through some very specific examples. One thing we know is that paraphilias, it's more common, like way more common in men than women. So there might be a genetic component that's working through here. So let's go through some different kinds of paraphilia. So voyeurism is viewing sexual you get sexual pleasure from watching sexual activity. Exhibitionism, exposing oneself to another person without consent. So you know how I said how just because it's not normal doesn't mean it's bad. Well, exhibitionism is bad because it's without the other person's consent. So it's not possible to get sexual pleasure through exhibitionism and have a healthy sexual life as an adult, because the other person that you're exposing yourself to is not consenting to this. So exhibitionism is going to be bad. But voyeurism, I mean, if you decide that you get sexual pleasure from that and you marry someone who, or you are intimate with someone who thinks that that would be fun too, or is fine with it, and someone else is brought in, you can see how if everyone is consenting and you're all adults and you're all okay with it and no one's getting hurt, then it might not be normal, but it's a choice. So um, we wouldn't call it bad. Exhibitionism bad because no consent there. Fetishism is when you're attracted to non-sexual objects or body parts. I think the one we hear about the most here is a foot fetish. Sadism, inflicting pain on a sexual partner. Again, sadism to me just sounds disgusting, but um, if the sexual partner is a masochist, we'll talk about that in a second, and gets sexual pleasure from getting pain inflicted on them, then that could be part, as long as both people are consenting, then that could be part of a healthy adult sexual relationship. Masochism, being humiliated or hurt by their sexual partner, that brings them sexual pleasure. And then pedophilia, always bad, always, always, always. Sexual activity with a prepubescent child, and children can never give consent. So this is always bad and really messes up. Kids can, I shouldn't say always. In my experience, my adult friends who were sexually abused as children, it has had a profound negative effect on their life. And so pedophilia, never good, never okay, awful, awful, awful. Now, how does all this begin though? Well, through classical conditioning, it makes sense, or at least we could see how classical conditioning could play a role. And I want to tell you about a study that's in your book that I think can help you see this. At least this is masochism. Why would anyone find sexual pleasure by being put in pain? Well, Pavlov, I think it was Pavlov, they would give the dog an electric shock and then food. So instead of the metronome, it's electric shock, food, they salivate. Electric shock, food, they salivate. Electric shock, food, they salivate. Eventually, an electric shock led the dog to salivate. So you could see in a human being, perhaps, perhaps the person experiences a situation where they have some kind of pain that's followed by sexual pleasure, and then pain, sexual pleasure, pain, sexual pleasure, and now just that pain gives them the sexual pleasure. Does that kind of make sense? So you could see how that would happen. So masochism may be caused by negative experiences repeatedly preceding sexual pleasure. And then these aversive stimuli might themselves become sexually arousing. All right, now how can we get rid of this, especially the exhibitionism and the pedophilia? Like, we got to get rid of pedophilia. So what are we going to do? So one thing that has been looked at is aversion therapy. And what we do here is you're going to pair that inappropriate sexual arousal with an unconditioned stimulus that leads to a very distressing negative feeling or emotion, what they're going to call a noxious unconditioned stimulus. So what's used often this is a funny one. Sorry. In this video, and again, I'm not going to play it because if I play it, I think the bandwidth gets too large on this video and it won't play on all of your computers. So watch this on your own. If you click on it when you go to the PowerPoint slides, you'll be able to see how in this, Phoebe's trying to help Rachel no longer have feelings for Ross. So whenever she says something about Ross, she's going to hit her, and don't really pop your friends, obviously, but hit her in order to try to make it like aversion therapy. So oftentimes what's used are drugs that make you sick. Other things that can be done is really bad smelling acid. So let's say you're someone who has pedophilia, like you're attracted to children. Then what you might do in therapy is be shown a picture of a child, and then immediately following it, a really, really foul smelling acid, so that your nose like almost feels like it's burning and it feels awful. Your mouth is awful. And that continually gets paired with a child. And then eventually maybe pair it with a child who's doing something not sexual, they're a child, but you keep pairing it. You see what I'm talking about. Until finally the person is no longer going to find any sexual attraction toward a child. Okay. The emetic drugs, these are drugs that make you vomit. We'll talk about it when we get to in the next video when we're talking about addiction. So if, but you could see how this would work with some of the paraphilias too. If the person's going to get sick, then they're going to perhaps no longer be attracted to that. Now, some of you are probably listening to this and going, whoa, that seems like we shouldn't be doing that. And if we're talking about pedophilia, we might have an easier time saying it's okay than if we're talking about masochism or sadism or some of the other things. But remember that some of the alternatives, like for pedophilia, you might even think are worse. Like surgical castration, well, it's more effective than aversion therapy, but it's highly invasive. It's very controversial, so it's rarely used. Chemical castration, where people take a drug that makes them incapable, like usually it's testosterone levels are suppressed, makes them incapable of becoming sexually aroused. Again, you'd have to regularly take the drug and you'd have to volunteer for it. So while we might look at sensory aversion therapy and say, oh, that sounds awful, like most of us would say, well, it seems kind of better than chemical castration or surgical castration. So anyway, this is classical conditioning so we've talked about classical conditioning with fear, prejudice, and paraphilias. And in the next video, we'll talk about drug addiction, advertising, and healthcare. Okay.